But yeah, I'm really glad to be here. As Henry mentioned, I'm co-director of Biology Fortified Incorporated, which is a group of independent scientists that strive to produce unbiased, science-based information about agriculture, including biotechnology. And we're a very small nonprofit with a tiny, tiny budget. So all the scientists that work in our organization also have day jobs. And it just so happens that I work for the USDA, but I did want to state that I'm not speaking as a representative of my agency. But with that aside, let's go ahead and get started. So, as all of you who work in agriculture know, there are a lot of really wonderful organisms on this planet. Lots of plants and animals that have incredibly good uses for humans. They're useful for food, feed, fiber, and fuel. But there's often a lot of room for improvement. Ever since humans started herding animals and planting seeds, baking bread or brewing beer, we've had genetic changes that we can make to improve those organisms. We can look at the wild ancestors of our crops and domesticated animals and easily see some of the huge changes that we've made. Now, there are a lot of ways to introduce those types of changes. We can breed varieties of the same species together, or we can breed them with wild relatives. We can use natural mutagenesis, which happens in nature, or we can speed up that mutation process using chemicals or radiation. Products of all of these different methods have been in our food supply for a very long time. Genetic engineering, or GE for short, is just another way to introduce genetic changes. But it's different in that it allows us to manipulate the genome directly as opposed to sort of making more changes on a broader base. So far, most of the genetically engineered crops that we've seen in our food supply are either insect resistant or herbicide tolerant, but that's definitely not all. There's a lot of other crops that are on the horizon, some of them that are very close to being introduced, being available on the market for us to eat. And those include healthy omega-3 oils in soybeans, non-browning apples, other nutrient-enhanced crops, and many more. So I'd like to focus on an example that isn't in our food supply yet, but that hopefully will be soon, which is blight-resistant chestnuts. Chestnuts were and still are to a small extent native to this area, but of course the chestnut blight was brought to the United States accidentally on imported trees and sickened our Native American chestnuts so much so that they're on the brink of extinction. We can use both biotechnology and breeding to help bring our American chestnuts back, which is just kind of exciting. So that's why I'm using that as my main example today. So there's actually at least two different research projects that are working on this, solving this problem. There's a set of researchers using breeding, and there's a set of researchers using biotechnology. The ones using breeding have taken germplasm from China, Chinese chestnuts, and bred them with US varieties, and they've gotten pretty good resistance. It's not 100%, the plants still get a little bit sick, but most of them survive, and that's really awesome. The ones using genetic engineering have taken a gene from wheat that sort of deactivates the primary weapon that the blight uses to infect the trees and allows the trees to live through it. So both of these methods have advantages and disadvantages, and personally I think both should be used because we don't know what's going to work the best out in the wild. But one thing that's, I guess, a little bit frustrating about our current climate is that even though both of these methods are sort of doing the same thing, they're producing a blight-resistant chestnut, one of them has to undergo an incredible regulatory burden, and the other does not. So the GE trees are going to have, if they're going to actually be allowed to be planted in forests, are going to have to go through a multi-year safety evaluation. They'll have to be looked at by multiple regulatory agencies, even though there's only one gene added, and that one gene is very well understood. But on the other hand, we have these trees that have been produced by breeding that have genes that are unknown to our US forest ecosystems from the Chinese chestnuts, but they can be introduced without any testing. Now, I'm not saying that breeding is dangerous or that we should necessarily regulate all products of breeding. That would be pretty silly. But it also seems silly that, these two things are being treated so incredibly differently. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the U.S. regulatory system, just to provide a little bit of background. In the U.S., historically, most of our regulations have been set up after there's been some major health or environmental problem that's come about. We can look at pesticides as one really good example. Probably many of you in the room remember a time when pesticides were virtually unregulated, and there were a lot of major health and environmental effects that came out of that. Thankfully, we're a lot more proactive today, and the EPA has pretty good oversight.
My name is Dr. Michael Hansen. As you know, I'm a senior scientist at Consumers Union. I've actually, my background is I'm an evolutionary biologist. My background in I did postdoctoral work at the University of Kentucky in the Rural Sociology Department, looking at the social impact of science. We were looking at the impact of biotechnology on plant breeding. And so I've actually been working on technology and food safety issues for 25 years. Consumers Union is part of a global network of organizations called Consumers International. We have 220 members in 115 countries, and ever since the late 80s, we've taken a position that genetic engineering is indeed different than conventional breeding, and that safety assessments should be required. Dr. Bodner tried to tell you that we've been doing genetic changes since agriculture began. That's true, but the way genetic engineering is fundamentally different than things that came before it is, even though you're only moving one gene, you have to modify it in certain ways that are technical that I can't get into here. And when you're inserting it, you have no control over where you put that in. And that can be incredibly disruptive, because if you look, for example, plants, genes that do similar things will be located on certain chromosomes in certain locations, and that will often be conserved over time. So this insertional mutagenesis can actually cause a bunch of problems, and I would point out that there's actually been global agreement on this. There's Codex Alimentarius, that's the food standards setting organization of the UN, jointly run by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization. It was an obscure UN body. This is its 50th year. It was set up for developing countries to help them set up food systems. It became of crucial importance starting in 1996, because that's the year that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade sets up the World Trade Organization. So written into the World Trade Organization, it turns out that if there's any challenges on food safety, any of the guidelines, documents, or anything that comes out of Codex is considered scientific and trade legal. Now, Codex has looked at genetic engineering. There was an ad hoc intergovernmental task force on foods derived from modern biotechnology. It met 2 4-year sessions, 2000 to 2003 and 2005 to 2008. Those sessions were held in Japan, either in Tokyo or Yokohama. I went to virtually all of them. We had a large delegation. There also were expert consultations that went with that, how to do allergenicity assessment. And what came out of this global process was these documents that there were 4 of them. One was a document on how to do risk analysis for foods derived from modern biotechnology, which is genetic engineering. There was a document on how to do food safety assessments from foods derived from recombinant DNA plants, one for animals, and then one for foods that derived from or produced from recombinant microorganisms. So that means there was global agreement that genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding, and that safety assessments should be required, and there was even some notion of what should be in those safety assessments. And actually, I was one of the international experts that went to the meetings that were held to come up with how to do safety assessments for engineered animals, and there were 2 of them. Now, we contrast this to the U.S., where the Food and Drug Administration, this coordinated framework, what that was is that was during the Reagan administration, which was part of the deregulatory initiative, and what they said is this new technology, biotechnology, we don't need new laws, we're going to take existing regulations and fit things in there, okay? So that means what FDA did is their policy that they put out, their first statement on policy was in 1992. May 28, 1992, it came out of Vice President Dan Quayle's office, out of the Council on Competitiveness. It was introduced at a Biotechnology Industry Organization gathering on May 27, 1992 as a deregulatory initiative. And it was based on the notion that quotes and new techniques are extensions at the molecular level of traditional methods and will be used to achieve the same goals as traditional plant breeding. So what that meant is, under the law, engineered plants are treated no differently than conventionally bred ones. This means there's no requirement for a safety assessment before they come on the market. The Flavor Saver tomato, actually Calgene asked for that to be treated as a food additive, asked for the antibiotic resistant marker gene to go through the food additive regulation, and they also labeled it as there were stickers on all of them. It was called McGregor, product of biotech. All the other plants have gone through this voluntary safety consultation. There's 97 of them. I have letters if people want to see them. There's two phrases that are in all the letters that are very important. One that was sent to Monsanto on September 26, 96. This was for Mon 810, the BT corn variety. And here's the key sentence. This is in all the documents. Quote, based on the safety and nutritional assessment you have conducted, it is our understanding that Monsanto has concluded that corn products derived from this new variety are not materially different in composition, safety, and other relevant parameters from corn currently on the market, and that the genetically modified corn does not raise issues that would require pre-market review or approval by FDA, end quote. So the FDA, contrary to what the public believes and contrary to what our ambassadors have been saying in other countries, the Food and Drug Administration has never made a conclusion about the safety of any of these crops. What they say is, Monsanto, we understand you think that these are safe and don't require review or approval by the FDA. And then there's a sentence that says that the company is, of course, responsible for anything they put on the market. So if people get sick or something happens, they'll be liable. But the FDA does not regulate, does not admit that there is a difference. They just do these voluntary consultations. That's not the same thing as a proper safety assessment. And finally, I would point out that in 2001, the FDA proposed another policy, because they never finalized that one in 92. In 2001, there was a pre-market notice concerning bioengineered foods, and this was this notion that companies would have to come forward 120 days before marketing, tell the agency, and actually submit data to the agency. And the rationale for that was that genetic engineering was different, that insertion of mutagenesis would cause a problem. And I just want to read from the Federal Register notice, and this is the FDA speaking, quote, because some recombinant DNA-induced unintended changes are specific to a transformational event, e.g. those resulting from insertion of mutagenesis, FDA believes that it needs to be provided with information about foods from all separate transformational events, even when the agency has been provided with information about foods from recombinant DNA-modified plants with the same intended trait and has had no questions about such foods. In contrast, the agency does not believe that it needs to receive information about foods from plants derived through narrow crosses, e.g. traditional breeding, end quote. That's telling you they've recognized genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding. They're still working under the 92 policy. What we've been trying to do is get the agency to require safety assessments, the kind of safety assessments that Codex suggested, and also require labeling because actually Codex has said labeling is fine. There was an 18-year fight, and 64 countries require labeling, so I'll stop.
Okay, that concludes the introductory section. I'll now ask for the questions, and we will have Dr. Hansen ask. Let's take your question.
Okay. I guess the first question I would ask is, because there's been this global agreement, do you agree that genetic engineering is significantly different than conventional breeding, and should there be required safety assessments before these products are allowed on the market?
Okay. Well, that's kind of, it's stated as a black and white difference, but I don't actually think it's a black and white difference, and that's supported by groups such as the National Academy of Sciences. It's actually more of sort of a spectrum. As far as the unintended risks, we have seen unintended risks from breeding. For example, one very well-known example, and I'm sure you're aware of, is celery that was bred for pest resistance. A great important goal could reduce insecticide sprays. But, oops, they also increased expression of something called, I believe it's sorrelin, 5-methoxysorrelin, which unfortunately causes horrible rashes in humans. So, unintended consequence, and that's not the only one. So with the method of genetic engineering, you could potentially create something that's very risky, but some examples, the inherent risk is lower. One example would be Arctic apples, which maybe you've heard of. They used a gene from apples to silence a protein that causes... Anyway, long story short, it makes it so that the apples don't brown as quickly, so that if they're bruised in shipping, they can be they won't have to be pulled from the supply chain because they'll still look nice, consumers will still buy them and things like that. So since they're using a gene from apples and putting it in apples, the inherent level of risk is lower than using, say, a gene from a virus or something like that. I'd like to talk a bit about insertional mutagenesis and whether or not it's inherently risky, but I'm running out of time, and I'm sure that Dr. Hansen will give me a chance to talk more about that later. My turn for a question. Great. Okay, so I'm sure that you've seen the recent review by Nicolia, and I've got a copy of it here if you're interested. It was called An Overview of the Last 10 Years of Genetically Engineered Crop Safety Research. And basically what these researchers did, and they're actually independently funded, well, sort of industry funded. They're researchers in Italy, and there was a organic crop organization that paid these guys to go through the literature and see whether or not genetic engineering had any inherent safety risks. And so they scoured literature for the last 10 years, and they concluded that there's only been a handful of studies that have shown a risk, in contrast to piles of literature showing the other way. Anyway, so what I'm interested in is, what sort of peer-reviewed information do you have, maybe that refutes this work by Nicolia and many others, just to show that there's inherent risks to humans or animals? You got a study for me?
Yeah, actually, there have Dr. Jose Domingo, who's an ecotoxicologist in Spain, has been doing reviews of the safety assessments that have been done on genetically modified plants for 10 years. He's published 3 sets of papers updating his literature review. The most recent one was published in 2011, a literature review of the safety assessment of genetically modified plants. And he points out, says, and there's an equilibrium in the number of research groups suggesting on the basis of their studies that a number of varieties of GM products, mainly maize and soybeans, are as safe and nutritious as the respective conventional non-GM plants, and those raising still serious concerns was currently observed. So that means people finding on both sides. It says, nevertheless, it should be noted that most of these studies have been conducted by biotechnology companies. That most of these studies that have been conducted by biotechnology companies responsible for commercializing these GM plants, most of the positive studies. There's also been a wonderful study that has come out that has looked at conflict of interest, and actually they independently looked at 97 studies, and they found out that if there's a professional conflict of interest, and that's defined as somebody that works for industry, there were 41 of these papers. Every single one of them were positive for a biotech. When there was not a conflict, there were 51, 39 were positive, 12 were negative. That difference is highly statistically significant, and it suggests that if you want to see if there's any adverse effects, and there have been significant numbers of them published that we could talk about, you will only see that if a study is independent. If there is at least one industry author, at least the data show so far, highly statistically significant, 41-0 versus 39-12. So that explains why a lot of studies don't find anything. Yeah. Actually, I would like to go back to, you were the one that brought up the Arctic apples and the browning, and how it's inherently safer because you're using a gene from apples and not from another source. Actually, what they're doing there is they're using, as I'm sure you know, RNAi interference, which is a microinterfering RNA. In Bioscience, what was just published is an article called RNA-Based Insecticidal Crops, Potential Effects on Non-Target Species. And it raises the issue that this RNAi interference can actually raise safety concerns because these tiny little pieces of RNA, they're not complete genes, they're 15, 20 nucleotides long, can actually have huge impacts. These USDA folks are calling, saying that there should be look for environmental and human safety. And in fact, the Scientific Advisory Panel of EPA on October 29th is holding a meeting to talk about the potential human health and environmental implications of this RNAi technology. I could get into a lot more detail later as to why this is problematic. So I would just ask you, are you willing to admit that RNAi does raise serious issues that should require a pre-market safety assessment?
And so the way that RNAi works is it uses a natural pathway that's found in pretty much every organism that it's been looked in. And if you take a piece of double-stranded RNA and give it to the organism, whether it's expressed within them or in some cases you can feed it to an organism, but that doesn't work very well. It only works in like nematodes. If you feed them a piece of double-stranded RNA and they eat it, then it silences the corresponding genes if there's a sequence that matches it in their body.
Any sequence that is the exact same.
If there's a sequence that matches the sequence of the double-stranded RNA that you provided. So this is a natural mechanism that organisms use pretty much to fight viruses. It's really cool. Very cool stuff. And there has been a couple of recent papers that showed there might be some stuff going on there that we're not aware of. So, for example, there was a recent study that researchers showed that a natural double-stranded RNA that's found in rice, that's not genetically engineered, just regular old rice, could potentially be affecting the way that cholesterol is processed in the mice. That's a little iffy. There's been some other studies that tried the same thing and they didn't see an effect. But I think what it really comes down to is what the sequence of the DNA is. We have a lot of genes in common with other organisms, but there's a lot of genes that we don't have in common with things. So we just need to be careful about the sequences is basically what it is. So if you're making a RNAi insecticide, that will of course be regulated by the EPA because they regulate pesticides and that would technically be a pesticide. But what they need to do is be very careful to choose sequences that are not also found in humans. All that said, the point might end up being moot because a lot of medical researchers have actually tried to make RNAi drugs. It would be really awesome if we could stop cancer by giving you a pill that had double-stranded RNA in it. But because those are degraded in our stomachs, it doesn't work. And if the drug companies can't make it work, it's highly unlikely. I mean, it still needs more testing, but it's highly unlikely that that's something that's going to be affecting us.
But those sequences were found in the bloodstream of humans in that Chinese study you referred to. So that means we know that those sequences do survive digestion. They do make it into the bloodstream.
Except follow-up studies have shown that that may have been contamination. So more work needs to be done.
Yeah, and there's actually, I'm sure you saw the study that shows whole genes can be found in the blood that was just published in the National Academy.
So you have claimed repeatedly that there are significant safety issues associated with foods derived from genetic engineering. But we have a huge body of literature and not just the U.S. approvals, but also approvals by other countries that have decided that they're at least as safe as conventionally produced food. So what I'm kind of interested in is a specific concrete example of harms to human or environmental health that has happened due to genetically engineered crops.
Okay, before I answer that, I would just like to correct you. There's no requirement for safety assessments of the crops in the U.S., so they did not submit, for example, feeding studies. Okay, so we could talk about the Seralini study, but I guess I will talk about the Finmore study. There was a study done in Italy where they took Monte 10, which is Monsanto's BT corn variety. They grew it in the same environment in neighboring fields in Lagriano, Italy, and then they fed it to mice for 30 or 90 days, and they wanted to look at the impacts on the gut and peripheral immune response. They wanted to look at more vulnerable populations, so they looked at weaning mice and then elderly mice, and they found significant changes in the gut microflora and in, let me pull it out, in interleukins and cytokines, and so they concluded that there was this difference, and they said therefore the GMO evaluation of the gut and peripheral immune response should be done before the compounds are put on the market. A second study that we'll quickly go through that was very controversial, that was the Cirullini study from last year that had tumors. Everybody trashed it because they said too small sample size, they only used 10 rats per group, and they used a strain of rat, Sprague dowlies, which spontaneously get tumors. The only problem with that is the Monsanto studies and most of the industry studies also use 10 rats per sample. In terms of Sprague dowlies, the reason those were used is because that's what Monsanto used in the study they did in 2004. Cirullini did the same study for 2 years. Monsanto, when they re-registered glyphosate in Europe, they had to do a 2-year rat feeding study that was done with Sprague dowly rats. Bottom line, on June 29th of this year, the European Union announced they're spending $3 million. There's going to be the MK603, the Cirullini study is being redone. They're spending 3 million euros on this. So if that study was complete nonsense, why did the European Food Standard Agency say long-term studies should be done, and the French Standard Agency said the same thing? So that work is going to go on right now.
Is that my question?
Yeah, so you asked what a safety assessment was. So do you agree that there have been studies that have found problems or not?
There have been a handful of papers that have shown problems, and the Cirullini paper, unfortunately, was funded by Greenpeace, so I don't know how that applies to that. I don't know how that, well, Cirullini has studies that have been funded by Greenpeace, so I don't know how it applies to that conflict of interest study that you mentioned that could potentially come into play. But there have been a handful of studies that have shown problems. But there have been many more studies, including many that have been funded independently by governments, academic institutions that haven't found problems. And so there's sort of, you have a handful of papers showing a problem, and science is complicated. It's very easy to have methodological errors, too few rodents, you could grow the crops in environments that are too different, because other studies have shown, gosh, if you grow the exact same variety of a crop in a rainy place versus a dry place, you have huge genetic changes in the way that the genes are expressed in different particular proteins, so it's really hard to do these studies. So it's likely that some of them are going to have mistakes, whether they're done with all academic rigor possible or not. But we've got a lot of studies that haven't shown problems. And of course, it's difficult to actually make a proper review of them. So the study that I mentioned earlier, the review, they just did the last 10 years. And they found, what was the total again? It was over 1,000, I think. Maybe almost 2,000 if I recall correctly, just in the last 10 years. And that's not even a full review of everything that was out there. So actually what my organization is doing, Biology Fortified, we're creating a database of all of the scientific literature, including Cirullini and some of the disputed studies, as well as everything else that we can think of, so that we'll be able to come out and say, hopefully soon we'll have a good categorization with as much information as possible so that we can make better judgments about these things.
Okay, that ends that round. Good?
Great.
A lot of information. We're going to go to questions from the audience.
Hi. I put my name in the pro mainly because our farm does use some GMOs. So I don't know specifically who wants to answer this question. You can kind of leave it up there. We have a dairy farm here in North Haverhill, and we process our own milk. We get lots of phone calls from customers asking numerous things about what we feed our cows, so on and so forth. The main GMO that we really use is a Roundup Ready corn. We've been using it for quite a while. Oh, that's it? Yes. Okay. I don't foresee that we would stop using it. This year we had an immense blight in our corn, whether or not that might be something that we might end up having to use GMO for. But when the customers are asking me,
Yes, question.
When the customers are asking me, do you use GMOs? I say yes, and then I try to explain myself because I want them to buy our product. And so what do I tell my customers?
It seems to me you just answer their questions. If they want to know if GMOs are used, you tell them yes, you use the corn. I'm curious, was the blight that hit the corn, did it hit the engineered corn, and was it by any chance Gauss's wilt?
I don't know that. It hit all the corn, some earlier than others. Some by mid-September was completely browned.
But
and
both the
others
engineered
later.
and non-engineered?
Yes, I mean,
Okay.
across the board, I believe all of it was hit at some, in
Yeah, so the only thing I do is I would just say tell the people, just be honest with them. But it should be pointed out that the labeling bill, for example, that is being talked about here in Connecticut, you wouldn't, here in New Hampshire, you wouldn't have to label your milk.
Okay. But if I don't mean to make another question out of this, but if they find out we use GMOs and they're not buying our milk, I mean, we're unique in the fact that we grow our own feed, we don't buy milk from anyone else, where bigger milk companies are buying it from hundreds of farmers. If they call Hood or if they call Gorelick and ask the same question, how are they going to answer? I guess I'm
You
just...
should say, look, people have different things. I would actually say some people, for example, prefer organic. Others actually prefer to buy from local farmers. So I tell people that, say we do use this, but we don't get milk from any other sources like people do. We all do it on our own farm. That's something we have that's unique. Because I think the more transparency there is in the market, the better. So just explain, because you do have a benefit there. And if some people, if that concerns them, that's their right for whatever reason they have for that.
So there have actually been quite a few studies done on feeding biotech crops to dairy cattle. And actually, so come and get my card after this, and I'll actually send you a particular study that I'm thinking of. And I've written a layperson's analysis of it as well. I can't remember the title of it right now off the top of my head. But they looked at the milk from cows that were and were not fed genetically engineered food, and the milk was the same, the proteins were the same, the cows had the exact same outcomes. So, I mean, if it's a product that you like using, do you have a website? I mean, I'm not going to tell you to market your product, but if you have a website, you could maybe put up a page and say, this product helps us to control weeds on our farm, and if we didn't use this, we'd have to use something else. And, transparency is great.
Okay. Thank you.
The next person in line after Slim will be Diane Harvey. No? Go ahead, Josie, you're next. I'm trying to get people to line up so we can keep moving. So Slim, you're next after Josie.
So mine is a similar question, what people ask and what people say. So my question is, how do I answer people who ask or say, I think that eating GMO corn or any kind of GMO vegetable is going to change the genes in my body and hurt me. In a way, you've kind of answered that, but your detailed really specific answers don't quite work when you're standing at the grocery store.
I don't know of any evidence that any food that you eat, whether it's genetically engineered or not, is going to change your DNA. There isn't a mechanism for that. I mean, there is horizontal gene transfer and some other things, but it's not going to happen in a realistic sense. I think you could also talk to them about the regulatory structure, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier, so just briefly, the FDA does do a safety analysis, and perhaps it's not it isn't written as mandatory in the law. However, every company that's put a genetically engineered crop on the market has gone to the FDA, and the FDA scientists, experts in the field, some of whom I know personally, go through reams and reams of data, and a lot of it's not released to the public, and that's not cool. I would really like it if the companies would be more transparent, release the data to the public, but unfortunately they're not right now. Maybe we can push them to do that more often. But the FDA does get that data, and they go through it, and they come to the conclusion that there isn't a safety concern with relation to food or feed from those genetically modified crops. So if you have consumers coming up to you in the grocery store saying, I'm worried about this product, I'm worried it's going to be unsafe for me, you can tell them that our federal scientists have gone through the information and they've determined that it's safe.
I would just like to respond to that and say, again, I can give people, if they want to come up for my card, I can show you, I can give you the URL for the government's website. Look at all the letters. They don't ever say that any of these things are safe. They say, for each one, Monsanto, it's our understanding, you think this doesn't require any safety assessment. Agro, Evo, Syngenta, they're all up there. Read them all. And if someone can point out to me, you just said that they made a conclusion. They don't make a conclusion. This is less than what they do if you had to add a new coloring agent or a new food additive. Those have to meet, the legal criteria is reasonable certainty of no harm. The reason that these letters don't, they could, if the FDA agreed with the company, they could put a line in the letter saying, we agree with this analysis, there's no difference. The reason they don't is their lawyers know this is not a safety assessment. They often don't have access to all the data, because I didn't read one of the sentences, and one of the sentences is on Data X, they submit a summary of the safety and nutritional studies, a summary. To do proper assessments, you need all the data, and they don't do that. If they do that and they claim they're doing this analysis and they make these conclusions, fine, then make it legal and let us see it so that we can do that. Because right now, there's global agreement, and any country in the world could pass legislation requiring safety assessments and turn around and block product from the U.S., and there's nothing we could do about it. And the FDA knows that. I've been in the room at those global meetings when all this was being negotiated. All we want is, we're not against the technology, we're just saying it's got to meet a certain level of safety. It's been agreed upon globally. If they're already doing it, because that's what the companies tell us, but the information is confidential, be transparent. Because it's my suspicion that the reason they don't want to turn over something is if something's there. If the data shows that it's perfectly fine and it could withstand scrutiny, I'd be the first one to say these are carefully designed studies. They're fine, just like there have been certain studies that have shown adverse effects that are poorly done, and I try to tell people, stay away from them. Some of these Russian studies that claim that there's hamsters have hairs growing out of the roofs of their mouth, I say stay away from that stuff. So you have to look at these studies, but again, make the data available, because when they don't and they say, trust us, I'm sorry, there's a long enough history where unregulated companies put out dangerous products.
I just had a really quick clarification. So you mentioned that food additives have to go through a process. The genetically engineered crops actually fall under the same rule. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that's how genetically engineered crops are regulated, the same way as food additives are. So it's the same level of scrutiny.
But they're letting them get away as being called grass, generally regarded as safe.
If they were recognized as grass, then there wouldn't have to be a safety assessment. There is a safety assessment. So that's not the same thing.
Okay.
No, there's not.
Question.
A report. Now, they're using nematodes in a test in strawberries, actually introducing it in the soil to help them do something, to keep something away from it or something. You know anything about this?
Yes.
I know I don't want them in my tomatoes, I know that.
Actually, there is biological controls. There are certain nematodes that are predatory. There's also nematodes that are plant pests. So, for example, there are tomatoes that are attacked by nematodes. That's a serious problem. But they're predatory ones that actually are being released as forms of biological control, because they then will get rid of the plant parasitic nematodes, and the yields go up. So it's like adding a beneficial enemy. It would be adding, like when people release ladybug beetles, or there's parasitic loss, trichogloma, bracon. So that's just that's just a form of that. So there are people that are actually, and I forget what the name of the nematode is. I think it's a trichoderma, but those have been put out for a number of different crop.
My question is, do other countries, Europe or any other country, do they allow GMOs? And if they do, how do they regulate?
Yeah, actually, Europe does have regulations for both labeling and for safety assessments. I can tell you that the consumer groups and the environmental groups in Europe have actually been very critical of the EFSA, saying that the assessments aren't good enough. But yes, they do them. They're more extensive. Well, since there's nothing done here, there's more extensive data there, but that's only a handful of crops. We've done 97 have gone through this sort of process here, and it's a much, much smaller number in Europe. And then other countries, there's usually just been assessments for food purposes, so that's usually for import. But yeah, the countries are now, since these Codex guidelines got adopted in 2008, so countries now are starting to set up their own regulatory schemes for genetic engineering, and we hope what they'll do is they'll follow the global standard.
So any country that's going to release genetically engineered crops, they have to set up a regulatory system, and it has to be science-based. Although sometimes they're not always science-based, sometimes they're more politically based, which doesn't always work very well. But yeah, there's these systems all over the world, and they sort of test there's a core set of information that's looked at, and I'd say that the main things are toxicity and allergenicity. They're trying to find out if there's any additional toxins. So if somebody tried to intentionally introduce a toxin or accidentally create a toxin, then that would be looked at. And also if there's increased allergenicity or any new allergens that are novel to that particular food. So there's a whole variety of testing that's looked at. They're trying to determine if the protein that's added has similarity to any known toxins or known allergens. They're looking at the digestibility of the protein, because if a protein is easily digested in your digestive system, then it's less likely to be an allergen. They're also looking at comparing the toxicity of a purified protein versus actually how much is present in the crop as it's expressed when it's regularly grown. So there's like a whole standard that's been set up that's sort of consistent across the globe, just sort of as the guidelines that are set up by these international bodies.
Although I just point out that one of the big problems we've always pointed out is that this is true for all the BT crops, but the safety assessments that are done on the purified protein aren't done on the protein that's extracted from the plant. They produce it in a bacteria, and they use the bacterial version and say it's exactly the same when it's not, because plants, for example, will glycosylate and sugar groups. And all known allergens are glycoproteins. All food and aeroallergens are glycoproteins. And so you need to be using the stuff from a plant source, and the EPA Science Advisory Panel has actually said this over and over again. And I would point out on Starlink, they pointed out Starlink was indeed that quinine seed was glycosylated. It also survived digestion. They were able to extract it from the bloodstream of the rats, and there were antibodies in the bloodstream of the rat. That's all documented for quinine C. It's probably true for the other cry proteins, and we've been trying to get the agency to actually study the right thing. Scientists have said that, but again, the safety assessments are done on bacterially derived protein, not what's actually in the plant, and that's an important distinction.
So, and to follow along on that, first of all, Starlink was never actually shown to be an allergen in humans. It had some factors like the lack of digestibility that showed it could be an allergen.
It had 7 of 8 characteristics.
But it hasn't actually been shown to be an allergen. It hasn't actually produced an immune response in humans, so that's sort of...
That's because the CDC used an antibody to the plant-derived form, and the EPA Science Advisory Panel pointed that out and said that that was not sufficient and that they should redo the study with the plant-derived form, and EPA and the CDC decided not to do that because Starlink had been pulled off the market, and they said we're not going to bother to put the money in. So that finding of nothing was because they used the wrong source. The Science Advisory Panel said that. Also for the level that they were were detecting. The Science Advisory Panel pointed out that the tests they were using couldn't detect it when it was in these other forms, and they said that is worthless and you need to redo that test, and again, they didn't do that either. Read the report of the Science Advisory Panel from November of 2010, and this is all in there.
So the reason why they're using the protein that's derived from a bacterial, they were basically taking the same gene that was put in the plant and also putting it in bacteria. Bacteria can be easily turned into little factories that will produce a whole lot of a protein, and that's why that's used. So I have an example from my own research where I was trying to produce high levels of corn hemoglobin in corn to try to increase iron levels. And I could produce a ton of corn hemoglobin in E. coli, and I could just turn out piles of the stuff. Right? Maybe not quite that easily, it's still hard. But I could make a lot of the protein in E. coli. But when I tried to extract the protein from corn, the expression levels were actually so low that it was really difficult to get that protein out. And the same thing happens with BT. The expression levels are actually very, very low. So in order to get enough protein to do a toxicity study in rodents, for example, you'd have to take acres and acres and acres of corn
But they're different.
and try to get it down. And I understand that it's different, but then what you do, when you do I'm talking. So what you do is when you do a whole food study, when you take the biotech corn and the non-engineered variety and you feed it to rodents, at the expression level that's found actually in the crop, then you can see if there's an effect. So you're still doing the whole food study.
All right, I recently was having a discussion with a fellow that's very, very much against GMOs, and he said to me that all of the obesity that's in children nowadays and the hyperactivity and many of the problems that young people seem to be having that weren't so strong before are all caused by GMOs. Could you guys comment on that? Is there any evidence of this?
So there have been a lot of changes in our society since the good old days, whenever the good old days may have been. And so it's really difficult, the 60s, or maybe it's the 50s, or maybe it's the 20s, who knows, but whenever the good old days were, a lot of things have changed. So many things that it would be impossible to pinpoint, one particular thing and say that's what's causing childhood obesity, or, what seems to be an increase in autism or an increase in allergies or any of these things. But there's a lot of things we can point to and say, oh, as these bad things have increased, something else has also increased, so it must be causing it. For example, the incidence of organic food has increased over time, the same time that we've had all these health problems. Could it be organic food? Of course not, that's ridiculous. That's what's called correlation, but not causation. Computers, home computers, that of course has gone up about the same time as all these other bad things that have been happening. Can we blame the rise of obese computers? All right, maybe that's the causation one, but it's a little bit indirect, right? So I think that's the key, is to think about, is there something that we've actually shown that there's a scientific basis for a cause, or is it a correlation that just seems to be happening at the same time?
Yeah, and I'll just say where that's coming from is actually those are coming from two particular researchers I can think of, and a film that tries to link it not only to obesity and hyperactivity, but Crohn's disease and autism and almost any disease under the sun. I think that goes way overboard. And yeah, there is, what you're seeing is all these folks are doing these studies showing infertility, whatever, between 96 and others correlates with the increase in acreage of GE crops. But as Anastasia points out, you could do the same thing with organic. And it doesn't, correlation isn't causation. So there's a lot of uninformed folks out there, and I would say it's on both sides. But so yes, I would agree, I think both of us would agree there isn't any evidence so far that any of these crops are causing obesity or hyperactivity. Now, certain pesticides with hyperactivity, that's another story, chlorpyrifos, but not GMOs.
Just kind of want to remind people that the current, I believe he's still the current Obama's food safety czar, Michael Taylor, was once Monsanto's vice president, and before that was Monsanto's attorney. isn't that interesting? And then, you know, look at all the people that are gluten intolerant.
Gotta do a question, Scott.
So anyway, my question is, this genetic engineering on food, it's like a genetic pollution. So if you have salmon with insect genes in them, in fish farms in the ocean, and they get away, if you have pollen from BT or Roundup Ready corn that blows in the wind, how do you recall that if things go wrong, if in time this turns out to be, like Agent Orange, like years down the road we find out this is bad, how do you recall this pollen in the wind from this genetically polluted corn and these fish with insect genes? That's my question to either one who wants to answer it.
So as I mentioned in my introduction, the genetically engineered crops are regulated proactively. So we know bad things happened in the past with pesticides, like I mentioned, and other things, because the regulations weren't there. But now, we do have a strong regulatory system. So before things can be introduced into the environment, we have to go through the regulatory system. And whether Dr. Hansen agrees or not, the FDA does do a thorough food safety analysis. The USDA and EPA do a thorough environmental analysis. So by the time things get out into the environment, they've been shown to be safe. Now, as far as preventing gene flow, that's a different question. I know that that's a concern for a lot of organic farmers. And so I think that the key there is to have neighbors talk to each other. If you have two neighbors that want to grow corn, one is growing a Roundup Ready, and one wants to grow non-GE and wants to certify it as non-GE, then they need to talk to each other, because if they plant appropriate buffer zones between the two, if they make sure to keep them separated by a certain distance, or if they plant at different times so that the pollen of the one is shedding at a different time, that the silks are ready on the other. There's a lot of methods can be used, so it's really important to talk to each other, use that fellowship that we had during dinner, and utilize sources like extension agencies, universities, and things like that, so that you can find information on how to prevent gene flow.
I point out that genetic contamination or pollution is a serious problem. And as for how carefully the USDA regulates things, let me just tell you a couple of stories. There was a Liberty Link rice called LL601 that was engineered to be resistant to this Liberty Link. It was planted on 1/10 of an acre in experimental plots from 1999 to 2001, and it was never planted anymore. In 2005, it was discovered that half of the long-grain rice exports of the U.S. were contaminated. That caused 20 countries to pull rice shipments. It cost over $1 billion in damage to the rice industry, the biggest hit in the rice industry. The rice farmers in Arkansas sued Bayer and other companies. Bayer argued in court that this was an act of God and was actually the farmer's responsibility. They finally settled out of court. They finally settled in 2011 for $750 million to pay back farmers. That was a contamination incident on something that was never commercialized, was never grown except on a little tiny plot. It was clearly grown next to foundation seed for rice. What was somebody thinking? That was the first one. Last year, there was, this Roundup Ready wheat that Monsanto had tested and pulled off the market in 2004, nothing. And then this summer, it appears in a farmer's field in Oregon and in the white wheat. And what happens is immediately the markets in Japan and Korea, because that's the noodle markets, they stopped buying for a while. And then what happened just a few weeks ago, there was a farmer bought regular alfalfa, planted it, and when it went to get exported to the Middle East, because that's where a lot of the alfalfa goes from Washington State, turned out positive. It was below the quote 2%, so that's considered okay, but the markets are rejecting it. So this is an economic issue, and the USDA's control over this has been pathetic, because I would just finally point out they cannot require that the companies give them the sequence so that they could independently detect if there's gene flow. USDA knows this. We've been trying to get them to get the ability to require that sequences so that they can actually be looking for gene flow themselves, but they couldn't. When this Roundup Ready wheat had to come out, they had to go to Monsanto to get the sequence.
I have 7 more people.
Can I just add one quick thing to that? I'm sorry, just really quick. So there are definitely problems when companies are doing things outside of what the guidance for them was. If Bayer was planting things so close to foundation seed, things may have changed. You know, I haven't been working at the USDA that long, but that's not something that would be approved. But if companies go out and do things that they shouldn't have done, you know, there's really not a whole lot that can be done about that.
I have a question. So I was going to ask a technical question, but here's the one that I think I'm going to leave feeling a bit frustrated this evening. You're both highly credentialed individuals. I assume that the organizations you were with, well, I know Consumers Union, I don't know as much about biotechnology.
545.
Right. But I assume that it's a credible organization. So as a consumer, as a parent, as a grandparent, how am I to make decisions? And of course, we've got a lot of farmers in the room as well. How are we to make decisions? Can the two of you agree on a framework that protects us professionally and personally, I guess is my fundamental question.
I would bet we could, actually. And that's something that I'm very interested in doing with Biology Fortified is, because it's a very long-term project and our organization doesn't have any money, so I have to work my day job, I don't have a lot of time. But what I would absolutely love to do is go to organizations like Consumers Union, Union of Concerned Scientists, Sierra Club, organizations like that, and say, what sort of things do your experts recommend? And then go to industry and say, what's feasible? And try to figure out something that actually makes sense that works for everyone. Unfortunately, government agencies don't have as much freedom as maybe they should in order to make regulation changes, which can be really frustrating, and I'm not saying that as a USDA employee.
But it's very true.
It's very frustrating. So yeah, there is probably a place where we could come to and say, this is the way that we could regulate and everyone would be reasonably satisfied. Whether or not it's going to happen in the foreseeable future, it's probably not. But in the meantime, we do have a regulatory system and it's working pretty well.
Yeah, and I just say, because they try to polarize this into a pro and anti. Yeah, what kind of, I'm not in the anti-camp, because we have enough of a history of putting things on the market only to find out later, oops, we made a mistake. That's why some of us got together almost 30 years ago and said, this is a new technology, let's try to get some regulations in place so that we're not 20, 30 years from now dealing with the same kind of problems that we were with pesticides and other things. So what I would like to see is the same kind of regulations. I can tell you exactly what should be in them because we fought for years to get this language into these codex documents. I know it like the back of my hand because actually working with the European Union and all these other countries where we were able to get a lot of good language in there. So I just think there should be required safety assessments and they have to follow protocols because all these studies, yes, the companies have done these digestibility assays, but they're completely skewed, and we could talk about that later. But I do think required safety assessments that everybody can agree upon what the protocols should be, and then I think there should be labeling, because people have a right to know they can make their own decisions.
I'd like to know from both of you what your knowledge is of the impact of this kind of engineering on plants to keep insects from damaging the plant, but what that has to do with the danger to a bee.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is bees. There's a thing called colony collapse disorder that they're all collapsing. There are folks that have wondered what this has due to. Direct impact of GMOs have been found in the sense of some of the pollen from the BT plants. If it's fed to the bees by themselves, they don't see any impact, but if the bees are weakened because they've been infected with nosema or other things, it can help with disorientation, and so they have a hard time finding things. But more importantly, there's an indirect element, and that's 88% of the acreage of corn is an engineered corn, and most of the BT is for corn rootworm, and it turns out that the expression when the plant first germinates isn't enough to control the insects. So what they do is all the engineered corn seed is actually coated with 3 insecticides and 3 fungicides. One of those insecticides is this neonicotinoids. That's the class of insecticides that has been most associated with colony collapse disorder. It's been banned in Europe because of this. There's all this evidence here. Before these engineered plants came on the market, there was very little use of these neonicotinoids, but now they coat every single biotech seed. So there is a connection with the neonicotinoids, and it's an indirect one through GE. So there's probably direct and an indirect, but it's most of colony collapse. Most people think it's these neonicotinoids, but there are other things that can happen. Bees can be stressed out because there's mites and nosema, and all these things can work together on them.
Sure. If you're looking for specific information, I would recommend the Bureau2 Society. They've done some studies. Their website will probably have a link to a really big USDA study that was just done that found that it's one particular disease in a type of mite that seems to be really stressing the insects out in addition to a lot of insecticides. There is definitely a problem with the neonicotinoids, but I would say that how do I put this carefully? There's still a combination of things, but with BT, we're seeing less broad spectrum insecticide sprays. So whereas the bees might have just been killed outright previously, now instead they might be being affected by these seed treatments, but it's not, so it's very indirect. The genetically engineered crops are not directly killing bees. That's the bottom line.
But I've understood it, I've gone on this journey of the state-by-state labeling, but there really are specific limitations, increased costs, state-by-state patchwork. So what is your suggestion then on how labeling should be handled? Statewide, federally, given the different repercussions?
The way this often works, I mean, it isn't though people have been trying to get national legislation for years. Sometimes if that doesn't happen, things work out first in the states before they go nationwide. If we look at the bottle bills that first happened in Maine, they said it was going to cost too much, now everyone does it. So sometimes the states have to be the incubators. As for the patchwork of state regulations, I've testified in most of the states so far and have actually helped behind the scenes. We're trying to make sure that the language is the same. So for example, the definition that should be used for biotech or genetic engineering should be the same definition that is in the Codex documents, because that's globally agreed upon, because that's also in the Cartagena Protocol. So this is all internationally legally recognized language. We're trying to get that in so that there wouldn't be a patchwork. It would just be state after state. But the industry knows what the secret is. As soon as one state goes, if the ballot initiative passes in Washington State, I predict within a few months you'll see an effort to come up with a federal solution.
I sort of find the labeling issue to be kind of strange, and I guess I'll out myself as a vegetarian. That's sort of the way that I view the way that I view labeling. So my default when I'm looking at a packaged product is that it may contain animal products. It might have something from bones or blood, or it might have something in there. So I have to look and see what are the ingredients, what evidence do I have that it doesn't contain this product that I want to avoid, even though I know it's perfectly safe to have all of these animal products. There's definitely no safety issue. I kind of see that being the same way with genetically engineered foods. There isn't a safety issue that has been shown, so at least not more than eating a whole lot. I mean, if you eat too much meat, you're going to have a problem too. So, I guess safety is relative. But so the default state of packaged food is that it may contain GMOs if it has corn, soy, canola, or sugar. If it's from sugar beets, the default state is that it probably does have some genetically engineered source ingredients, unless it's labeled organic or non-GMO. So slapping a may contain GMOs label and everything doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because that's kind of already the default. So I guess I'm not really sure what the goal is with mandatory labeling, because the companies, there's no way that they're going to actually. I don't see it as being realistic, because the cost would be so high to actually test every single product to say definitively this has or this doesn't have. they'll just put a make and chain on there to cover themselves. They know.
I have two more questions, two more people with questions. I have three minutes to do it, so Colin Hawkins is next.
Yes. It's my understanding that it takes 30 years for a human being to fulfill a generation. This stuff is being checked out, but it's not happening with that kind of a time frame. Many of us with grayer hair will not be around to see the impacts on human beings. And my question is, how do you see the hodgepodge of checking and assessing, addressing the impact to human beings? I see your flag now. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly.
Sure. I would say that we can look at the literature. You know, these hundreds and hundreds of studies that have been done, including many that have been done by independent sources, have not found there to be a special danger with genetic engineering compared to other things. Yet, right. But, you know, there's a lot of things that may be really dangerous. For example, kiwis or acai berries are very new in our food supply. Those could potentially be really harmful too. So it's kind of like you have to amass enough evidence to show safety and then decide where you're going to draw the line. Otherwise, there wouldn't be very much to eat.
I just say we don't know. These crops should be required to go through safety assessments before they come on the market. Most of the studies often aren't on some of the things that are on the market, and there's the whole issue of how you design the studies. Most of the ones that don't find problems, for example, they're not using isolines, they're not being grown in the same environment, on and on and on. And when you look at things where they control things, sometimes they do find them. I'm the first to say, of course not every engineered thing is going to be hazardous. Some might not be, but just like with food additives, they have to go through a certain assessment process before they're allowed on the market. That's what we're saying should happen with GE.
We'll let John ask question, is the last one.
The legislative committee considering House Bill 660 on labeling in New Hampshire has been told that anything that comes from field corn, soybeans, canola, cottonseed, rice is probably genetically engineered, but not fruits and vegetables except for papaya. Now,
ask a question, John.
It's recently come to my attention that many of the varieties of cucurbits that we grow, squash, cucumbers, are derived from genetically engineering of certain traits and getting that bred into it. And the farmers that appeared before that committee also had no idea of this either. Would you care to comment on that? And
Sure.
how we're going to work on labeling by variety?
So as far as I know, there's only one genetically engineered trait that's found in cucurbits, and that's yellow quickneck squash.
It's also in yellow quickneck squash and zucchini.
And zucchini. It's a virus resistant. So that's the only trait. So if they're saying there's multiple genetically engineered traits, they may be referring to something that was traditionally bred, and they're just talking about traits, because I know farmers use the word traits to refer to both genetically engineered and traditionally bred traits, so that might be it.
Right, but what they could do is there is this virus-tolerant yellow crookneck squash that could be bred into other varieties. The data, the last published data was in 2006, and it was 11% of the acreage. And I've actually talked with somebody in a company in states where the virus is a problem, like in Iowa, somebody bought 40 squash, and 2 of them were positive. So that would be about a 10% rate. So. But that's just in areas where I would have to go back because I can't remember whether it's PODI or it's either X or Y virus. And so you look at those parts of the countries where that's a problem, there could be a potential for that squash to be positive. And yes, it could spread to other cucurbits.
That concludes our discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists very much for Very informative.